Bret Hart wrote Western novels. He wrote books about cowboys and miners. And they all took place in the West, and there was always the good guy and the bad guy, and of course we know what happens in the end of the story. The good guy always wins. And the good guy, you know, because he has a white hat. Which of the following was not a social critic? James, William James, Frank Norris, Jacob Riis, Sinclair Lewis, or I think his name was Fran Tarkenton for Brett. I think it's Fran Tarkenton. Okay, William James, which one was not the social critic? Guesses, or are you going to leave this question blank? You're going to leave it blank? Chris, you're going to say who? Norris. And Adam, you're saying? It's Tarkenton. Okay. William James, pragmatist philosopher of the progressive movement. Frank Norris was a progressive muckraker. He wrote The Octopus, which was about the railroads and how they were sucking everything up like an octopus would. Jacob Riis, you already know from How the Other Half Lives. Sinclair Lewis, 1920s writer who criticized middle-class America, and his two most famous books are Hello? Sinclair Lewis. I'm going to report you to your English teachers. Have we ever heard the story, the books Main Street and Babbitt?
No.
Maybe I should report your English teacher. Okay, so Sinclair Lewis, Elena. Sinclair Lewis and wrote two books, Main Street and Babbitt, where he criticizes middle-class values. Okay? And Tarkenton wrote a lovely book called A Tree Grows in Brooklyn, which is about a girl growing up in Brooklyn in, I think it's the 1930s or 40s. I don't remember. I haven't read this book since I was in middle school, so it's been a while. Okay, last but not least, Ashcan School of Art and the Armory Show. In 1913, American painters put on an art show called the Armory Show because it took place in a building called an armory. The Ashcan School of Art encouraged Americans to be, oh gosh, what do you call them? Impressionist and post-impressionist painters. Impressionists would be like over by Chad's Head, there's two little girls on a beach, okay, painting. That's Mary Cassatt. She was an American Impressionist painter. A post-impressionist painter would be somebody like early Georgia O'Keeffe paintings when she painted New York City at night and they're dark with pinpoints of light, that kind of thing. Okay. Women in the late 1800s. Any questions? I'm not for sure what this question went after, but I'm going to talk to you about what I think it talked about. In the late 1800s, clothes, like always before, were a reflection of your wealth. Like the wealthier you were, the heavier the materials, the richer your materials were, etc. Women wore in public very elaborate gowns and hats. There was a movement amongst progressive women by 1890 to limit women's clothing to 7 pounds a person. Now think about all the clothes that you have on right now. Do they weigh 7 pounds even? Doubtful. Okay? Really doubtful. Women's gowns could weigh as much as 30 to 50 pounds, depending on how much elaboration, how much cloth there was with them. And some of them had a great deal of cloth built into the backs, and they wore those bustle things to make their butts stick up more. They wore corsets. There was a movement to have less restrictive clothing, to get rid of corsets, to go with bloomers so you could ride your bike, all those kinds of things. So you end up with kind of the women who dress by the time fashion, which is really clothing which is pretty restrictive, and then there's this movement to get rid of the restrictive clothing. Farmers and railroads, the problems. Yes, there were. Okay, farmers were mad about railroads because remember that railroads had promised them that they would transport them cheaply to the west, and then once they got west and they set up their farms, they would transport their goods back east cheaply. They didn't do the second part. They transported them cheaply out west, but then they charged them exorbitant rates to take their grain from Nebraska to Chicago or whatever, to store their grain, those kinds of things. So farmers began to advocate government ownership of railroads. Farmers got grange laws passed, which said states could regulate railroad rates. The railroads, of course, challenged, and the first challenge comes in the case of Munn versus Illinois, which is where the courts ruled that states could, in fact, rate or set rates for railroads. But then the next case, less than a year later, they said, well, they can only set rates within the state. And the third case, about 2 years after Munn, said that states didn't have the right to regulate for railroads at all. Okay? Pendleton Act, 1883, did what? Sets up the civil service system, which means that you're given a government job based on your ability to do the job, not based on patronage. The Pendleton Act was in response to the assassination of Garfield. Okay? Garfield was assassinated by a guy who felt that he was owed a patronage job. Tariffs in the post-Civil War period. Remember that in the antebellum period, Southerners kept tariffs from getting too high because they had enough political clout to at least do that. Once the Civil War is over, who's in control? Northern businessmen. And what happens to tariffs in the late 1800s, early 1900s? They just keep going up and up and up and up until except for the one which tariff lowered? Underwood-Simmons. Good. Coinage of silver is a major issue in the late 1800s. Should there be silver coins or just gold? Should there be paper money? That's all an issue. Coinage of silver is sometimes referred to as free silver. So if you see the term free silver, it means the same as coinage of silver. Coinage of silver stopped in 1873, with the act that demonetized silver. Why did they demonetize silver? Because it had been too expensive to coin silver coins. It was worth more not as coins. And of course, as soon as they demonetized it, what happened to the price of silver? It drops, 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 and we end up with then only gold, and that causes some problems with the economy. Coxey's army. Coxey went to Washington to ask, in one of the panics, I think the 1893 panic, to ask the government to set up public works programs and to have legal tender, which meant paper money that was backed by gold or silver. Did the government do either one? No. And Coxey found himself arrested for walking on the White House grass. The Grand Army of the Republic was a veterans group of Union soldiers who spent a lot of time lobbying Washington to give them like better bonuses, give them benefits. There was the one guy who wanted to get a pension because he was blind, and he said he went blind because he'd had diarrhea during the Civil War, that kind of thing. Wave the bloody shirt was a political campaign tactic of the Republicans in the late 1800s. Every time the Democratic candidate looked like he was going to do well, they would wave the bloody shirt, which means bring up the Civil War and blame it on the Democrats. Okay? Any questions about any of those?